"Buy a cow, get a working Apache woman for free," shouted the farmer, until a cowboy stepped in. The sky hung low over the plain, heavy with grey clouds that hadn't wept in weeks. Dust drifted slow as smoke across the dry ground, tracing the forgotten paths of wagon wheels and bare feet. A wooden sign creaked gently in the wind, outside a crumbling barn, the kind of place where everything once mattered and now barely stood. The morning had no colour, just the faded beige of scorched earth and the cracked blue of a sun not yet born. A woman moved in the far corner of the cattle pen, bent at the waist, tying old rope around a calf's weak leg. Her hair was loose, tangled with wind. Her face turned away like the rest of her had already left this place long ago. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch when the farmer shouted at the boys tossing hay, nor when he kicked the trough with his boot to scare the cows into place. Her hands were steady, worn and brown like the land itself, not belonging to anyone but shaped by everything. A boy laughed somewhere behind the fence, then another. The kind of laugh that echoes mean the kind that tries to make a ghost out of someone who's still breathing. But she didn't turn. From the porch, the old farmer coughed and leaned against a post, eyes scanning the dusty road like it owed him something. A rusted sign hung beside him, hand-painted and crooked. "Buy a cow, get a working Apache woman for free." The paint was peeling, but the words still stuck. He spat into the dirt and chuckled. "They like 'em quiet," he muttered to nobody in particular, watching the woman move like a shadow under a dying sun. A wagon rumbled from the distance, its sound breaking the hush like thunder before the storm. It was still small on the horizon, but it rolled with purpose. The horses didn't slow, the woman straightened. Just a little. Her eyes lifted toward the sound. No expression crossed her face, but her fingers trembled just once as they brushed dirt from her skirt. The farmer shaded his eyes and grinned. "Another buyer," he said, louder now, voice pulling the farmhands to the fence line. "Hope he don't mind the deal." The woman didn't move from the pen. The clouds above her shifted, and for a second, light broke through, sharp and pale like a truth no one wanted to speak. The wagon grew larger. Wheels groaned. The dust curled around it like ghosts, and from that place between silence and storm, a voice rose, not from the woman, not from the farmer, but from the man on the wagon bench. It was calm, low, and it cut through the heat like rain. "I came for the cow," he said. "But touch that woman, and I'll bury this land with your lies." The laughter stopped. The woman closed her eyes, and the wind changed. The townsfolk gathered slow, like dust around still water. They leaned on fences, rested boot heels on crates, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not out of anger, but out of that particular boredom that breeds cruelty when left too long in the sun. She stood alone beside the cattle pen, the heat pressing into her skin like punishment. Her feet were bare, ankles wrapped in old cloth, the kind that once held stories now reduced to rags. Her hands, though calloused and steady, hung by her side, like they'd learned not to expect kindness from this place. The farmer stepped forward, chewing the edge of a toothpick, his hat casting a long shadow that fell over the woman like a noose. "She'll plow, cook, clean. Don't speak much. Don't eat much either," he laughed. "Might as well come with the cow. She's been here longer." The crowd didn't laugh, but they didn't stop him either. A woman in a church bonnet turned her face away. A man near the hitching post spat into the dirt. A child clung to his mother's skirt, eyes wide, watching something he didn't yet have words for. "She ain't mine," the farmer continued. "Was traded to me when her man died up north. Figured I'd get my use before someone else gets theirs." "World's fair that way." The woman didn't blink, but her knuckles whitened around the wooden gate she leaned on. Her face remained empty, a canvas too often erased. Only her throat moved, one slow swallow, the kind that held back more than thirst. "That's slavery," someone murmured near the back. The farmer's voice cracked louder. "It's business," and she stays quiet, like a good worker should. "You want loud? Go buy a wife," no one laughed. The cowboy dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with the weight of a man used to silence, but not this kind. His coat brushed dust from his side. His hands didn't reach for a weapon, but his stillness was louder than a loaded gun. He stepped forward, eyes on the woman, not the crowd. Then quietly to the farmer, "What's her name?" The farmer chuckled. "Don't matter." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "It does now." Silence fell like ash. Even the horses stilled. The woman's gaze slowly lifted, just her eyes like the sky parting slightly in a storm. She looked at him, as if remembering something she'd never been allowed to keep, her own name. The farmer took a step forward, bluster swelling. "Now you wait just—" But the cowboy cut him off, softer than wind, but firmer than stone. "You sold a cow. Take your money." He dropped a pouch to the ground. "But you don't own people. Not anymore. Not ever again." The crowd watched, frozen. A boy near the trough dropped his hat. The woman stepped back from the gate, and for the first time in years, no one stopped her. She didn't speak as they left the town behind. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt, and every step she took seemed borrowed, like the land beneath her hadn't yet decided to let her go. The cowboy walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Just there, silent, steady. Like he knew not to crowd someone who had spent too long being owned. His wagon waited a few miles west, shaded by a dying tree with one stubborn branch still holding leaves. The horses stood still, trained not by reins but by routine. The way quiet men often train things, not through fear but presence. He helped her up the side without touching her, not even a hand. Just a gesture, a palm open, arm low, no offering, not demanding. She climbed in without meeting his eyes. For a long while, the wheels rolled over gravel and memory. She stared ahead, hands folded in her lap like prayer or defense. He said nothing, just drove. By dusk, they stopped near a stream where the air smelled of wet moss and pine smoke. He unhitched the horses while she stood motionless, watching the sky shift from orange to indigo. "You hungry?" he asked, not looking at her. She didn't answer. He unpacked bread, a flask and a tin of beans, set them by the fire without ceremony. Then he walked a little ways off and began to chop wood. The rhythm was slow, not to impress, not to fill silence, just the sound of survival. She waited until he wasn't watching, then sat down by the fire and broke the bread in half. Ate one piece, left the other untouched. When he returned, he noticed, but said nothing. The fire cracked between them, but the space remained wide. Later, as the stars blinked open above the trees, she shifted in her seat, pulling her shawl tighter. A cold wind had crept in, the kind that reminded you how far you were from anyone who knew your story. He stood, walked to the wagon, and returned with a blanket. Held it out. She stared at it like it was a trick. Then slowly, not taking her eyes off him, reached and took it. Not a thank you, but a nod. Barely there. That was the first moment. The second came when a coyote howled in the dark. She flinched. His hand moved, not toward her but toward the rifle by the wagon wheel. Calm, no rush. "Just readiness, you're safe," he said. Not as comfort, as fact. She looked at him. Not for long, but long enough. Something passed between them. Not trust, not yet. But awareness. Recognition. Like two people who had been quiet for so long they could hear what others never said, and in that hush, under the stars and firelight, something fragile began to grow. Not hope, not yet, but room for it. The cabin sat deep in the pines, wrapped in stillness and old wood. It wasn't much. One room, a stove that whined when lit, a bed too small for history, and a chair with a leg that limped. But the roof held, the walls stood. And for now, that was enough. She entered first, pausing in the doorway like the air needed permission to accept her. Her eyes scanned the space without expression, the way people do when they've lived in too many rooms that never wanted them there. She didn't sit, didn't speak. He dropped his saddlebag in the corner, stoked the fire and pulled the curtains halfway closed. Not to hide, but to soften the world outside. The storm came that night, not fierce but steady. Rain tapped the roof in rhythm, and the wind curled around the chimney like a whisper that wouldn't go away. He boiled water for tea, his hands rough but sure. She stood by the window, arms crossed tight, her reflection flickering in the glass beside the trees. He set the mug on the table. Not near her, not far, just there. She didn't touch it for a long time. Then, quietly, she sat. The fire crackled. Shadows moved along the log walls like memories crawling toward warmth. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words in their weight would only bruise what silence had begun to heal. The next morning, she swept the floor. No one asked her to. Her movements were quiet, efficient, respectful. He chopped wood outside, the thud of axe against log the only sound between them. By evening, he noticed her wrist, swollen, a deep scrape bruising dark across the bone. She must have fallen days ago, maybe during that cattle roundup. Maybe no one had noticed or cared. He reached into the cupboard, pulled out a jar of ointment and some clean cloth. Walked toward her slowly, held it out, then stepped back. She stared at the jar, then at him. Her eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp born not from anger, but from too many kindnesses that came with prices. "I won't touch you," he said gently. "Just the wound." Still, she waited. Then, with a breath like surrender, she held out her arm. He worked carefully, wrapping the cloth around her wrist, his hands barely grazing her skin. Her pulse didn't speed. Her shoulders didn't flinch, but her eyes softened. That night she cooked, not much, and beans and onions in a dented pan. The smell filled the cabin, warm and familiar. He waited until she served herself first, then he took his plate. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind now, not emptiness, but rest. By the third night, the chair was fixed. The stove burned hotter, and a small bundle of sage appeared on the window ledge. Hers. Placed there without a word. She still hadn't told him her name. He hadn't asked again, but he knew something deeper now. The way she folded her blanket at dawn. How she walked barefoot on creaking wood without making a sound. How she left half her tea untouched, always. She watched him too. How he counted the firewood twice. How he fed the horses before himself. How he never locked the door, not once. And in the stillness between breath and chore, a quiet understanding settled like dust in the corners. They weren't healing yet, but they had stopped bleeding. The snow came late that year, slow and mean, not the soft kind that quiets the world, but the kind that stings when it lands, like memory that refuses to die. The wind had teeth again. The trees no longer whispered. They moaned. She stood by the window that morning, fingers wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. Outside, boot tracks led from the barn to the well, his. And in the distance, far past the tree line, something else moved, a horse. Then another, and a third. 3 riders, black against white, cutting through snow like ink through paper. No rush, just certainty. She didn't say a word. Just placed the cup on the table and stepped away from the glass. He knew the sound of hooves in winter. He knew the silence that followed was worse than thunder. By the time she reached the porch, he was already outside, coat on, rifle leaned against the frame. Not in his hands, not aimed. Just there, waiting. "They found you," he said, not looking at her. She nodded once. "Law?" She shook her head. "Worse," she whispered. "Him, the farmer, not dead. Not done. He hadn't come for the cow. He'd come for the thing he thought he still owned." The 3 riders stopped just before the fence line. No words were exchanged, just posture. The farmer sat tall, gloved hands folded over his saddle horn, mouth curled in that same dry sneer. "You took something," he finally called out. "Ain't yours to take." The cowboy didn't flinch. "I paid for the cow," the farmer spat. "Not talking about the cow." The wind sliced between them, sharp as blade. "She ain't property," the cowboy said. "She was mine." "She's not." Inside the cabin, the fire cracked. A pan boiled over on the stove, hissing steam into empty air. No one moved to stop it. Outside, time stretched, not frozen but coiled, waiting to strike. The farmer reached down, pulled a paper from his saddlebag, waved it like it mattered. "Got a contract. Says she's mine till debt's cleared." "Debt," the woman hissed under her breath. The cowboy didn't take his eyes off the man. "That paper's ash. The second it touches snow." The farmer leaned forward. "You can keep the cow, stranger, but the Apache goes back." She stepped forward then, not behind the cowboy, not beside him, but ahead. Just one step. I'm not going back. The farmer's jaw twitched. You don't get to choose. She stared at him, no rage. Just weariness layered so deep it had turned to stone. Her voice didn't rise. It lowered. I wasn't yours even when you thought I was. The cowboy glanced at her, a flicker of something crossing his face. Pride, maybe. Or awe. The farmer nudged his horse forward, but the cowboy raised his hand. Not threatening. Just still, leave now, he said. Before the storm does what I won't. Silence. Then one of the farmer's men turned his horse. The second followed. The farmer held a moment longer, eyes burning. But he didn't speak. Then he too turned. The horses vanished into trees, swallowed by snow and shame. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The cowboy didn't say anything. Neither did she. He picked up the contract, now damp and torn, crumpled it once in his fist, and fed it to the fire inside. No words, no victory cry, just the quiet warmth of a decision made. Dignity stays. Fear goes. The next morning arrived colorless. Not grey, just empty, as if the sky itself refused to take sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, soft as breath, and the frost on the windows clung like hesitation. She sat at the table, unmoving, staring at nothing. A thin crack had formed in her teacup. She ran her thumb across it, back and forth, again and again, like tracing an old scar. He was outside, splitting logs. The rhythm was different today, slower, heavier. The knock came not as a bang, but a dull thud, not even on the door, but on the frame, like the house was being warned, not the people. He turned first. She stood behind him before he could reach the handle. They opened it together. It wasn't the farmer. It was the sheriff. Broad shoulders, cold eyes, papers in hand. Behind him stood a younger deputy, shifting from foot to foot, like a man who didn't want to be there, but had nowhere else to go. The sheriff cleared his throat. Got word of an unclaimed indenture. Apache woman. Debt owed. No one answered. He looked from the woman to the cowboy, then back to the woman. We ain't here to drag her. Just need confirmation she's not. Stolen. The cowboy stepped aside. She's not. Then who claims responsibility? He didn't answer right away. Just turned to her, quietly, and in that look the truth passed. Not possession, but choice. She stepped forward. I do, she said. The sheriff raised a brow. You, that ain't how. I do, she repeated, firmer now. I claim my own name, my own hands, my own damn breath. The deputy flinched. The sheriff didn't blink. You understand what that means? He asked. No papers, no protection. You go missing, no one comes. She looked at him, jaw set. No one ever came before. Silence hung like a noose between them. The cowboy crossed his arms, voice like wind before snowfall. This land's mine. Cabin's mine. Firewood's mine. But she's not something I own. She stays because she wants to. The sheriff stared long and hard, then turned to the deputy. Write it down. The boy fumbled with a notebook, hands trembling. What exactly, sir? The sheriff looked again at the woman. She stood still. Not defiant, just unshakable. Like a mountain that had learned how to survive every storm. The sheriff took off his hat, scratched the back of his neck. For a moment the authority faded, and only weariness remained. Write this, he said softly. She stays, the deputy blinked. That's it? That's it. They left without another word. No papers were signed, no deals were made, no victory was announced. But something far older than law had passed through that doorway. She sat again at the table, and this time she poured the tea fresh. He joined her, nodding once. No one smiled, but something in the room softened. Maybe it was the warmth of the stove. Maybe it was the way the wind no longer howled. Maybe it was peace. A quiet, imperfect peace, but peace nonetheless. It came in pieces, a drip from the eaves, a softness in the soil, a bird that dared to sing before the frost was gone. The snow melted slow, pulling back from the earth like an apology. Beneath it, stubborn wildflowers pushed through, small and unsure, but alive. The cabin changed too, not with paint or repairs, but with breath. The windows opened more often. The kettle whistled longer. There was the sound of sweeping in the morning. and the smell of bread that sometimes burned, sometimes didn't. She no longer stood near the door. She moved freely now, in and out, bare feet on wet grass, hands tending to the soil behind the barn where nothing had grown in years. She spoke little, but when she did, it was not careful. It was real. He built her a bench by the stream, didn't say why. She didn't ask. But most afternoons, she could be found sitting there, still, watchful, as if learning to trust the water's direction. He worked the land not for profit, just enough. Sometimes she helped, sometimes she didn't, but neither of them kept score anymore. Letters came from the town occasionally, news, prices, weather, sometimes a name they recognized. She never asked about the farmer again, and he never brought it up. Whatever weight he had carried for her, he now shared without needing thanks. One morning, she carved something into the side of the cabin. A word in her language, small, barely visible. He didn't ask what it meant. But that night, he left a lantern burning beneath it. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and though the past still lived in her body, in the way she touched her wrist when tired, or the way she stood silently in doorways before entering, it no longer ruled her. She was not healed, but she was whole, not owned, not erased, just there, breathing, choosing. One evening, as the sky turned to dusk, she sat by the fire with her hands resting in her lap. He passed her a folded cloth, new fabric, fresh thread. A gift. She looked at it for a long moment, then placed it beside her without a word. But her eyes, they said everything. The room grew quiet, peaceful, almost sacred. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines, carrying only what it was meant to, and somewhere beneath the soft hush of twilight, the land whispered back her name, but not her pain.